Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Here's your host, Representative Rick Crawford.
Hey, folks. Welcome to Tune In. I'm Rick Crawford, and I am pleased to welcome Representative Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming. When we come back, we'll talk about urban versus rural. We'll talk about waters of the U.S. We'll talk about the Endangered Species Act and a whole lot more. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we are back, and I am especially pleased to welcome my friend and colleague from the state of Wyoming, Cynthia Lummis. And it's great to have you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm impressed with your office and your ability to communicate with your constituents from here. This is unique.
We're having a lot of fun with this. This is the 8th installment of Tune In, and it helps us sort of get some of the Washington message out to our folks back home and give them a little insight that they might not otherwise hear, because, we just can't rely on the media to tell our story and tell what's going on. But one of the things I like to do when we have members come in and visit with us is to talk about their background a little bit. And you and I hit it off almost immediately because you're a rodeo girl.
That's true. I come from Cheyenne, Wyoming. That's where I was born and raised. Cheyenne has the world's largest outdoor rodeo. It was started in 1897. And my great-grandfather was on the first Cheyenne Frontier Days committee. So my family has stayed involved in Frontier Days through the generations. And I had a chance to serve as Miss Frontier for Wyoming's greatest outdoor rodeo, Cheyenne Frontier Days. And I was crowned Miss Frontier by Roy Rogers.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, it was 1976, so it's getting to be a while back. And he and Dale Evans were performing at Cheyenne Frontier Days, and so it was quite a treat. And I think I appreciate it more now that I'm older than I even did at the time.
Sure.
Yeah, it was really something.
That's neat. I love that about you and your experience with that, and we have that in common. But another thing we have in common is obviously we represent rural districts. Now, for folks who don't know, the state of Wyoming is what's called an at-large state, which means you're the only representative that the state of Wyoming has. So I've got 30 counties. You've got the entire state of Wyoming. And I know that's a challenge for you geographically, but what are some of the biggest challenges that you face as a rural representative versus sort of the major metropolitan areas, what I call the urban versus rural dynamic?
Well, Rick, as you know, it's very difficult for people from urban areas to understand that one size does not fit all. So whether it's Obamacare or any other piece of legislation, it doesn't translate well to work both in a large urban district and a frontier type of district, whether we're talking healthcare and hospitals and critical access hospitals, whether you can stabilize somebody who has an acute injury and move them to a larger hospital that has more physicians and with specialties. The scale at which you and I are dealing with issues in our communities is so different from what they see. And so we have to really be vigilant in painting a picture for our urban members about how very different things are in rural areas.
I think it really kind of speaks to your committee assignment as a subcommittee chair on natural resources. You chair the subcommittee on the interior. Now, for folks in my neck of the woods, we don't necessarily think about the Department of the Interior, certainly not as much as you would out west, but that's critical. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is WOTUS, Waters of the U.S., and how that's impacted rural states like Wyoming and like Arkansas, and what the long-term outlook is for that type of policy that's been implemented by the administration. Talk about that.
Well, I'm sure in Arkansas, as certainly in my state of Wyoming, water laws have been administered at the state level very effectively. The ability to allocate water among different users and among different uses, whether it's agriculture or municipal or industrial, making sure that we have enough water for fish in our streams, that we're conserving its water quantity and quality, is an important function of state government. And state governments have been doing it well for decades, and in some cases, well over a century. And for the federal government to come in without demonstrating any need, without demonstrating any inability by states to adequately regulate, they just come in and say, now these are all waters of the U.S. Now the EPA is going to come in and we're going to regulate water, is just unconscionable. For example, there's some people in my state built a pond to water their livestock, got all of the state permits necessary to build this pond, and then the federal government, EPA, comes in and says, under waters of the U.S., you can't have this pond, and you're going to have to tear it out or face $37,000 in fines every day. Well, that is, there's no reason for the federal government to be in that arena of regulation. And that's why for most states, this Waters of the U.S. rule is among the worst regulations we've seen come out of the administration.
I'm glad you brought that case up in particular because, believe it or not, I go back home and people ask me all the time, what about that case in Wyoming?
Yeah.
What about, and that's kind of a benchmark or sort of a watershed, for, no pun intended, as it applies to this rule and why it's so wrong and so overreaching. And we're facing some similar possibilities in the state of Arkansas. And of course, we're a cow-calf state, so, we're going to have stock ponds on our farms and ranches, but we're also heavily, row crop oriented on the eastern side of the state. So we irrigate heavily. Rice is grown in standing water. And are we going to regulate that rice water? The answer is, by their definition, no. But then you read further down into the WOTUS rule, and it's sort of, it gets so ambiguous that the list of exemptions on the front end are really kind of taken out of consideration as we implement and subjectively regulate these people. So I'm glad you're on the case. And, the previous committee chair, Doc Hastings, came to Arkansas year before last and had a hearing on the Endangered Species Act. And we're seeing, where you in the West have been dealing with this for considerably longer than we have, we're starting to see a proliferation of this, an expansion of this in the state of Arkansas. So how much of a challenge has that been for you in the western states?
Well, it's a huge challenge. It really dictates so much of what we can do with our own land. And in Wyoming's case, where we are the largest exporting state of energy in the nation, we're number one producer of coal, number 3 in natural gas, number 7 in oil, number 1 in uranium, number 1 in wind resources. So we even have a lot of clean energy resources. Everything that we do is impacted when a species is either listed or considered for listing. Lately it's been the sage grouse, and there's huge sage grouse habitat in Wyoming. So the manner in which our mineral production is controlled by where the sage grouse chooses to place their nests or leks is critical. The wolf changes the way that people can graze livestock. Or even have pets in Wyoming. And that species was proven by sound science had to have recovered. They were introduced under the Endangered Species Act as a non-essential experimental population, and yet it changed the whole way that our wildlife populations are able to reproduce. The number of moose, the number of elk in certain areas are suffering significant declines. And livestock depredation is an issue as well. And yet, even when the wolf was delisted, some environmental groups went immediately to a friendly judge here in D.C. and got it relisted. So what you find out is you can put tens of millions of state dollars into preserving habitat, into recovering a species. And you can be successful, according to sound science, in recovering a species, and yet still have to live with conditions that are intolerable to a strong economy. Well, we were seeing that for decades in the West because there's so much federal land. And so it was easier for the species that were on federal land to receive immediate action from the federal government. Now those of you who are east of us that have less federal land within your borders are experiencing it. For example, the northern long-eared bat is affecting more states east of
We're
the
one of them.
Mississippi than west. And it will affect your ability to even cut timber off of private land.
Right.
And so I think that it has awakened a lot of members of Congress from the east and is going to help us bring about some needed updating to the Endangered Species Act.
I'm glad you brought all that up. You mentioned the bat. We're dealing with that too. That came up in the hearing that we had year before last with Doc Hastings, and not only that, but a couple of aquatic species that were really expanding the critical habitat that was proposed. Let me shift gears a little bit. And folks that have been watching, I know that they have been impressed with how smart and intelligent you are with all these issues. So I talked about you being a rodeo cowgirl. What they don't know, your folks at home know this, but my folks in Arkansas will be really impressed to know that you were first elected at age 24 in the state legislature, that you clerked for the Supreme Court of Wyoming, that you practice law and private practice, and that you own and operate a family ranch. So my question is, you've been in public service for a long time, and you've managed to balance the public service as well as your private enterprise. And to me, that's a great, great combination that gives you perspective that not a lot of members of Congress have. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, for example, when I was ranching, there was a species of mouse, the Preble's Meadow jumping mouse, that was proposed for listing. And I had to comment on the rules as a landowner because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife had pegged our ranch as a potential mouse habitat, even though we hadn't seen a jumping mouse for 30 or 40 years. So I've experienced some of these issues that we're dealing with. I was an irrigator on our ranch. I put up hay. And so when we talk about waters of the U.S., it is the water that I was irrigating with that I was getting state permits to irrigate with and complying with state water law and working with our state superintendents of our water district to make sure that we're using our allocation in a fair way compared to our neighbors. All of that was working so well. And then I come back to Washington and they say, it doesn't matter if it's working well, we're taking over. We're the new sheriff in town. And so having that direct experience has been helpful. I also had an opportunity to serve as the director of state lands in Wyoming. So we had mineral production off state land, we had timber production off state land, grazing on state land. And we were able to pursue those activities through the stewardship of private lessors, and they were taking better care of the ground than the federal government can, because the federal government cannot have as many boots on the ground that care as much for every water hole, every creek, every parcel of land. They are not there to see when an invasive species like leafy spurge or Russian thistle or Canadian thistle come in and are taking over an area. So when you have proactive management by people who have good stewardship obligations and skills, you have a better product. That's also true of our timber resource. We find that whether it's state lands or private lands, the ability to thin the forests and produce a healthier stand of trees that have more sunlight and keep the understory clear so you can have adequate grazing improves the wildlife habitat. It improves the ability of the snow to be trapped in those areas and retain the water until a later time of the year when there's runoff. And it also helps the trees fight disease, so we don't see huge stands of our western Rocky Mountain forests succumb to the bark beetle, which has contributed to some of our catastrophic wildfires. In other words, the ability of mankind when exercising sound stewardship is a better resource manager than the federal government can ever be, because they have that heart and love for the land. And that's what I learned by being a rancher, by loving the wildlife I'm around, by knowing that there are ways to graze that keeps that grazing resource available to both wildlife and livestock, and can do it in a way that's really healthy for the resource. So that personal experience that then can be deployed in Washington or in the Wyoming legislature, whatever it is, it's there's nothing like it.
Well, yeah, I like to call it active environmentalism versus environmental activism. And I think that farmers and ranchers are on the front line of active environmentalism, and you certainly brought that experience to Washington. Folks in Wyoming know what a jewel you are and what a resource that you are, but I'm glad now folks in Arkansas recognize that not only are you serving Wyoming very well, you're serving the nation very well, and we're glad we have you as an ally and a partner. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I want to tell the folks in Arkansas that they are blessed by your service, because you too have the interests of rural America in mind, and when you pull out your voting card and you're voting your district. You're voting on behalf of the people you represent in Arkansas, and that's what the People's House is about.
Absolutely.
And they ought to be really proud of you. I know I am.